Well, do you want to introduce me?
I can hear.
If you stay for the annual meeting, I brought some extra lays. So you can tell people that you got laid at our annual meeting.
Ooh, dear. Okay, introducing Joe WolfArth. I don't need to, yeah. I think everybody knows Joe. He's been a member of our church for a very long time. And he's been president of our church, and he's done all kinds of work for our church, and we really treasure him. He's also a very wonderful pet sitter. If you ever need a pet sitter, Joe WolfArth.
Thank you. I first joined our church in 2002. I had lived in South Florida and moved back to town, and I went to both of the Unitarian congregations, the one in Ormond and our church, and I signed both books because I didn't know you were only supposed to join one congregation. So then I had to decide, and my decision was for CUUC. The germination. I'm going to share a little bit of prehistory of CUUC as told to me and us by Audrey Barcelow. In the 1950s, young married couple Audrey and Charlie Barcelow came to Florida to create a better life for themselves and their children. They observed the racism and other social issues of the American South, and they resolved to take a stand for a better, more optimistic way of looking at the world and human society. Unitarian Universalism would beckon. In 1961, Unitarian and Universalist Christian sects with deep roots in the northeastern United States merged, creating the framework for today's Unitarian Universalist faith. Here in the Daytona Beach, Florida area, the Barcelows would find other like-minded progressive thinkers, like Herbert Tippin Davidson, whose family bought the Daytona Beach News Journal newspaper. Davidson had come to the area in 1928, the year our local hospital, which is now Halifax Medical Center, was built as a boy along with his parents and grandparents when his family bought the local paper. Goodbye, Chicago, they said. Hello, Florida. The Davidson family was Jewish, and Tippin Davidson loved the arts. He studied music at New York's Juilliard Art School and worked as a professional musician before he entered the family business and got involved in helping to publish the newspaper. He and the Barcelows joined a group of locals in Daytona who found the values at the center of Unitarian Universalism compelling, especially the belief that all are welcome here, which is at the heart of the concept of radical hospitality, as we Unitarian Universalists call it today. There we go. These folks initially met at the Daytona Playhouse on the city's beach side before developing a vision of building their own meeting space, which would take shape in a place of honor beside the famed Ormond Hotel in Ormond Beach, located just east of that city's Granada Bridge. Possibly, there's somebody in this room who doesn't know the history of Hotel Ormond, which was started in the late 19th century, the 1880s. It became a thing, and it got bigger and bigger and bigger until it became the second largest wooden hotel in the United States, right behind the Hotel Coronado in San Diego, California. Ormond Hotel invited people from all walks of wealthy elite, including John D. Rockefeller, to come and winter in sunny Florida. So in the space next to this revered ancient structure behind the post office on the Ormond Beach side, they decided they would build a meeting hall for Unitarian Universalism And guess who built it? Charlie Barcelow's construction firm, run by Charlie himself with Audrey by his side while they raised a small army of children. I don't know how you guys had the energy to do that, including Debbie, who's here today. Wave, Debbie. She's the daughter of Audrey and Charlie. And I know that you have been drafted by Audrey and Charlie many, many times over the years, Miss Debbie, because I saw when I looked through old Board of Trustees meeting minutes from our church many, many times, those meeting minutes were submitted by Deb Cravata. So, good job, Audrey, running the family and helping to run the firm and getting that church built in Ormond. A lot of work went into it. And it became a successful congregation in Ormond Beach. The UU congregation, then known as USDBA, UUSDBA, Unitarian Universalist Society of the Daytona Beach Area. That's a lot of letters. This would become a thriving hub for visionaries, artists, and free-thinking progressives in Ormond Beach. And the Barcelows would watch their children grow up and make lives of their own while new families came to Sunday services. And by the mid-1990s, the Barcelow construction firm also had a fine reputation for building quality houses in the local area. If you want to know more about that, ask my cousin Rhonda, who's sitting in the back. She will tell you. People brag about living in a Barcelow home. Next. Young couples like Mark and Laurel Mooring were moving to our area still and looking for places where they could bring their children to a UU Sunday school. And the congregation in Ormond Beach offered religious education for children that taught respect for the world's faith paths and religious traditions. And kids like theirs would create the beautiful chalice images painted on glass that now grace our foyer here in our building on West Street. In the future, once we had our own church. We didn't steal that. That was made by the kids in our RE program. So at the beginning, 30 years ago, people were talking about how to make another community where people of all ages could come together and form their own congregation. And Charlie Barcelow discovered that experts' opinions were in agreement. The best location for a house of worship was in the center of a metropolitan area. So an idea was formed. What if a group from the Ormond Beach congregation began a new UU church in the very heart of Daytona Beach? Folks like the Moorings wouldn't have to drive all the way from their home in Port Orange to the Ormond Beach side to bring their kids to Sunday school. A central location could boost membership. So in 1996, a group of people at the Ormond congregation began to form a serious plan to branch out on their own. And what they did was they created a group to vision for CUUC. And this led to a steering committee, which was responsible for coming up with answers to all the questions. How do we have infrastructure? How do we have things like hymnals, seating? How do we have things like podium, altar pieces? All of that arose from those original conversations 30 years ago. And a location in central Daytona was found, which was at the Nova Village. Nova Village is where office and business space was available for rent because the group didn't have enough money to buy a building or build a building. They found a rental space at Nova Village. If you go today to Bevel Road and Nova, there's an Aldi there, which I shop in regularly. That's Nova Village. You had to drive back from where the Aldi is, and you would discover Community Unitarian Universalist Church, because one of the first things that was purchased was a great big sign, and I think it might be the one behind you today. There needed to be a big sign to let people know you have found us. Said that. My research that I did last week was looking into the first few years of the church before I came around. How did it start? This is how it started. It started with the germination, with an idea, with people that had shared values, shared commitment, shared opportunity, wanted to create a warm, welcoming space for folks to come and bring their children and learn about Unitarian Universalism. And some of the people that were involved in that, you'll see their picture on the back wall behind, next to the clock behind us. Terry Duncan, who became the Kids RE director, Dennis Warner, Pat Gadbaugh, Carlin and Fred Hamilton, Beth and Sandy Levine, Laurel and Mark Mooring, Jan Stauffer, Linda Justice. These people were absolutely essential to getting that original group together and making it happen and getting a location at Nova Village created. Now, there was even a choir director at the beginning of CUUC, which was Mr. Tom Lively. And I remember sitting next to him at Nova Village in services a few years later. And in a subsequent time, we had Joan Estrada, who was a member of ours, who led a choir. So we've actually had a choir in the past. And the thing that happened in that first year, in May, the first service of CUUC was held at Nova Village. So that's why we have our annual meeting every year in May, because it's commemorating that initial service. And I remember going to members' homes for a potluck gathering where there was a big birthday cake that said, "Happy birthday, CUUC," which would happen in May so that we could commemorate the ongoing life of our church as it grew and grew. CUUC began a search for a minister in 1997 and called Reverend Barbara Morgan, who had been serving a congregation in the Pacific Northwest. Reverend Morgan relocated to this area with her partner in life. She was herself divorced, a mother of adult children, and soon to become a grandmother. She was a lesbian and she was advocating for LGBT people as we were known then. And the board asked her to help grow the church. She offered to help heal hurt feelings that might exist between members of the Ormond congregation and CUUC. It's a sad truth that although CUUC grew out of that Ormond congregation and seemed to do so with the blessings of that congregation, evidently the number of members who defected to CUUC might have been a surprise to folks in Ormond. Laurel Mooring told me that when she and the other parents decided they would come to CUUC with their children, and CUUC made Terry Duncan the children's RE director, that Ormond had just invested in a new playground, and that equipment sat unused when all the kids followed Charlie Barcelo like the Pied Piper to CUUC. I said, "Oh, do you think that?" I think the other thing that happened too in Ormond was when people joined the new church and became members of CUUC, it probably affected their budget because Ormond was outgrowing its physical space, the building that Charlie had built. And in a few years, in the early 2000s, they would undertake a big project to build a new building, which is there today. And they used the footprint of Charlie Barcelo's original building and just expanded it so they'd have more space. So if you ever go up to Ormond, like for a concert, like in the winter when David Roth comes, you can say, aha, this is the building that sits on that footprint of that foundation that the Barcelos put here way back in the 1950s, was it? Back in the start. It was a long time ago. So the idea that I want to highlight is that vision is a powerful thing because without that visionary status, none of this would have happened. We have depended upon people with vision for 30 years to make it happen, and CUUC is still happening thanks to people with vision. Most of the family groups with children were happy to come to Nova Village. And because of that, Nova Village became the home for CUUC in those initial years. And what happened was, I don't know whether the vision was bigger than the reality, but it looks like from our old Board of Trustees meeting minutes that the budget wasn't able to keep up with all the expenses. Having a paid religious education director for children, having a paid minister, having all the things you needed on Sunday mornings, budget concerns, and the rented space and making it all happen became a big issue for our treasurer, who at that time was Pat Gadbaugh. So after some debate, the Board of Trustees decided not to renew their contract with Reverend Morgan because they just couldn't afford it. And they didn't renew their contract with the religious education director. And at that time, some members left the church. The upheaval was serious enough that splitting a congregation affected our Board of Trustees itself, and a new Board of Trustees needed to be elected in order for CUUC to keep facing the new millennium. We were then operating under a financial deficit, and active members of the board and congregation devoted themselves to problem solving. One of the people who became a board member around this time was Barbara Jean Smith. The late Barbara Jean Smith, who would serve as Board of Trustees Secretary. Another person who came around that time was Debbie Zill. Wave, Debbie. And you guys helped keep the church going. Now, people don't like to talk about finances, as I've noticed, and I heard a lot of stories about what happened during that time, and nobody really told me, well, we were broke. But the Board of Trustees record shows that our church was broke, but it managed to keep going. Vision was there, and commitment was there, and the board kept problem solving, and they moved into a smaller space at the Nova Village, which is why when I came there, it wasn't in the same physical spot. It was still in the same office park and business park, but not in the same physical spot. Some of the people who contributed to the growth of our church and the subsistence and the continuation of our church at that time were Lloyd and Lori Dunham, Tom and Sina Zane, and of course, Mark and Laurel Mooring. These people, movers and shakers as they were, kept it all going. In 2001, that list would also include Connie Baker, Jean Skinner, Gordon Hart, and the late Dick Nunez, who was a wonderful storyteller, as I recall. Despite having an actual designated building fund, CUUC's leadership began to look at the cost of properties for sale in addition to seeking less costly rental spaces. And at that time, a consideration was that the Unitarian Universalist Association had begun a program to lend money to congregations seeking a dedicated church home, a building for purchase in their local area. By that time, by the end of 2001, Suzanne Ronneau, wave Suzanne, she was serving as our BOT president today, but at that time was, I think, the secretary on the BOT. And yep, she was serving as the secretary, has shared with me that she was initially drawn to CUUC because of an outreach group called Dawn. Dawn was a pagan group that was meeting in the CUUC location at Bevel Road's Nova Village. And there appears to have been a natural progression at CUUC because they had previously hosted a program from the Unitarian Universalist Association called Cakes for the Queen of Heaven. If you've heard of it, raise your hand. Okay. Cakes for the Queen of Heaven was created to draw from multiple traditions and faith paths, a program honoring the goddess or the divine feminine principle as it manifested in many forms in many religions and faith paths. Also, at the beginning of the new millennium, CUUC officially became a welcoming congregation of the Unitarian Universalist Association, affirming our commitment to provide a welcoming space for what was then known as the LGBT community and today is often described as LGBTQIA+, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, questioning, intersex, advocates, asexual, and anybody else that falls under the umbrella. It's a big umbrella. I wore my rainbow today. In 2002, Suzanne Ronneau became CUUC's treasurer. This lady has worn many hats at our church. In 2003, Debbie Cravata, Audrey and Charlie's daughter, who's sitting right here, I made you wave earlier, so I won't do it again. She was serving as our BOT secretary, a very important role, while discussions were made about moving the church to a smaller rental space at Nova Village. And again, many hats have been worn by the same people that volunteered year after year after year. Thank you for your service. Thank you for your service. Thank you for your service. If you're in this room and you're still coming to CUUC, hey Carmen, thank you for your service. This is a church that has run so well with volunteer power, and we still are making it with volunteer power. They talked about joining with another UU congregation in Volusia County because of the financial issues and because of not having a permanent home. Conversations were had with the DeLand UU congregation, which ended up selling their beloved A-frame and buying that beautiful church building in downtown DeLand, and that distracted them from having the idea that they should join up with another church. By 2004, Barbara Jean Smith had become CUUC's administrative assistant because our church could afford to have one. And what she did is she printed the order of service bulletins, she published the newsletter, she filled a lot of empty spots and wore a lot of hats, which are things that today we have assistants from Melissa and in a new millennium, Mr. Jimmy, to do. What I can tell you in the mid-2000s, we had boasted two choirs at different times, many guests in the pulpit over the years. We had a Christian fellowship which met regularly, and I felt very welcome there because they were UU Christians. So nobody told me this is the right way to be a Christian. They just said, let's talk about what that means. When someone asks you, what does Christianity mean to you? And we had hosted Buddhist groups. We would continue to do that. We had members, including retired and still working teachers and educators, Sunday school teachers, even a retired minister, Reverend Lloyd Dunham, who had been ordained in the Methodist faith. And he always said if he had known what Unitarian Universalism was, he would never have become a Methodist minister. He would have been a UU minister, probably to a small congregation with a much smaller paycheck. And I said, well, maybe it worked out well for you. But he graced our pulpit many times and spoke to us about famous UUs from history, which some of us still are doing. Thank you, Laura Chilkett, for your contributions. We continue with some of the traditions that got started in our church in those early years. Barbara Jean Smith would found our own Mistletoe Cups group in 2006. Cups is the Covenant of Unitarian Universalist Pagans. Barbara Jean knew me, and she knew that I'm an astrologer, and she said, do you really believe that the motion of the sun and the moon and the stars affect our lives here on Earth? And I said, sure, absolutely, because they affect the tides. And don't the tides and the full moons affect our lives here on Earth? And Barbara Jean said, well, you understand that makes you a pagan. And I said, oh, I qualify? And she said, pagan's a big umbrella. Comes from the ancient Greek word paganos, which meant country dweller. So there were fancy people that lived in the cities like Athens and went to fancy temples. And then there were country dwellers. And they would do things like leave an offering at a roadside shrine, honor the nature spirits in the areas where they lived. And I said, oh, I'm totally hep with that. That works for me. And Barbara Jean said, good, help me start Mistletoe Cups. So for a few years, we had Mistletoe Cups. And because of that, I was invited to serve on the board of Cups National, which was a 3-year term. And I did it because I was younger then and had more energy. Honest confession. When I look at people in this group that are much older than I am and see you all running around doing things, I just don't know how, but my hat's off. Y'all are amazing, inspiring. I joined our board in 2005. 2 members came to a party I was hosting at my house, Bud Cullison and his wife, Pat. And Bud said, I want to invite you to join our board of trustees. We're going to have an opening on the board. I said, Bud, you must be out of your mind. If I join the church board, I will be the youngest and the poorest person ever to serve on the board of trustees. I won't be able to save the church if it falls into a financial situation. Bud said, well, we've been in financial situations before, and we've always survived. And on top of that, I think you'd be really good on the board of trustees because you have a degree in art. I said, yes, I do. Bud said, we need creative thinkers on our board of trustees. Please consider joining the board and serving. And I was like, wow, gosh, I don't think I can say no to that. And here I am, more than 20 years later, still serving in whatever way I can. I've been on the board of trustees. I've been on the worship committee team. I've done so many things, and I've enjoyed every minute of volunteer service because it gives you back more than you give, I promise you. This church is an amazing creature of its own. I always like to say it's the little church that could, the little engine that could. CUUC just keeps going. What happened as soon as I joined the board in 2005, Nova Village, having just changed hands, sent our church a letter that said the new owners wanted more rent. And here the board had spent years trying to find somewhere else that we could move to so we could pay less rent because we didn't have a building fund set up to buy a building. So we found shelter at the UCC in New Smyrna Beach, which is here in New Smyrna on Faulkner and Washington streets. And it was a good deal because they were renovating and restoring their physical plant, their buildings. And they were building a new building so they would have more space for meetings after church. And they were restoring their historic church building, and they really could use the rent. And the compromise was that they said their parking lot was small and that we could use that space only if we met in the afternoon instead of the mornings. So for a few years, from 2006 to 2010, we met every Sunday afternoon at the social hall of the UCC here in New Smyrna. I liked it because it allowed me to sleep in. I like to sleep in. Didn't do it this morning because I was still working on my presentation. But we had a guest who was from the southern region, as it's called now. Once upon a time, Unitarian Universalists belonged to a church, which belonged to a district, which belonged to a larger district. Wait, the church belonged to the cluster. The cluster belonged to the district. The district belonged to the nation. But they reorganized it a few years ago, and they said, we're going to do away with all of those little divisions, and we're just going to have regions. So now we're in the southern region, which runs all the way from the East Coast to Texas. We're here in the southern region. Why is that important? Only if you were representing, like you went to General Assembly and they said, what region are you from? But what happened was, why did I go on that? Why did I go down that rabbit hole? There's a reason. Oh, yeah. We'd already become a welcoming congregation. We were welcoming all different kinds of people into our pulpit, and we were doing it on Sunday afternoons while we were meeting at the UCC in New Smyrna. So we knew what our goals were, and we were working on our goals. Barbara Jean was getting our Mistletoe Cups group going. Our pagan group was thriving. We soon had a Buddhist group forming. Suzanne hosted Buddhist group meetings at her home when she lived in Port Orange at a different location than she lives now. And things were happening. Things kept happening. In 2010, because we got advisement from someone who became part of our regional direction to stop meeting on Sunday afternoons because people think Sunday morning church. They do not think Sunday afternoon church unless they were raised in some kind of a church that had afternoon stuff or stayed all day. And you're probably not going to find a lot of those people. Find a place where you can meet on Sunday mornings. And that's how you grow your membership. And I said, boy, you know what? I think he's right. I'm going to have to give up sleeping in on Sunday. And we found Dudley's Memorial Chapel, which was willing to allow us to use their chapel at no charge to us. We asked them, how much rent would you like? Because we were paying rent at the UCC in New Smyrna. And Dudley's said, we don't want your money. We have to keep our office open because we have a memorial chapel. And people who are grieving come stumbling in on Sunday mornings and say, I need to set up a memorial service for someone I love who has died. So our office has to be open, but we can't schedule memorial services because a lot of people who might attend one are going to church somewhere. Why don't you guys come and use our chapel at no charge every Sunday morning while you build up your building fund so you can purchase a building? And that led to 7 years of meeting on Sunday mornings at Dudley's Memorial Chapel. And once again, I'm going to wave to Audrey Barcelo because Audrey came up with the incredible, fabulous idea of now is the time. If we don't have rent, if we're cutting overhead because we already have the things that we need, let's make a building fund that really can grow and see if we can grow it enough to purchase a property. And then we'll have a building of our own. And if it hadn't been for that, thank you for your service, ma'am. There's no way we'd be in this building on West Street today. It was thanks to that building fund, which grew and grew and grew until in 2017, we were actively looking for a church home, a building of our own. And I'm going to call on you, Anna, that wave your hand. Anna's very good friend, Marcy Kallenberger, and Anna went and looked at properties here in New Smyrna that were for sale and scouted them out. Was it you? You were the realtor, so I know that you had support from others. Anna was looking for properties. We went and toured properties. We walked through some buildings that were for sale, and there was one reason or another why it wasn't going to work out more than once. And as it happens, one day, David and Sharon, who were sitting in the back, y'all can wave, were at home, and Sharon said to David, where's West Street? And David said, what? And she said, West Street in New Smyrna Beach. There's a building for sale that's already a church, like a church, a real church with pews and stuff. What? So when we heard about it, probably every one of us said, where's that? I mean, I'm from Holly Hill, and West Street, as you can see, is 1 block long. And to our great joy, we were able to make an arrangement to purchase this building. And hooray, finally have a physical home for our church, which happened 9 years ago. So my comment was, well, usually a 21-year-old is ready to go out into the world, but our church is 21 and buying its own building. Good job, kid. So hooray for CUUC. We were able to get into this building and purchase this building. We had only minimal changes to make it functional for us. And we were actually able to pay off the mortgage on this building before the pandemic hit. Great thanks to Rosa Jean Lake, our treasurer, who saw that happening. And you're our treasurer now. I don't know if you were then, but it was all happening. And we couldn't believe the good fortune that we were able to finally purchase a building in 2017. And then when we were ready to come into this building and have our very first service here, and we'd got everything all clean and ready, a hurricane blew through and postponed service number 1 scheduled at 403 West Street. And to our great joy, when Debbie Zill came over to check how bad was the damage, if any, she discovered that there was like no damage to the inside of our building, and there was minimal damage to the grounds of our building. Some tree limbs came down. Is that right? Tree limbs came down. We had a neighbor that lived here on the street with a chainsaw who came over to help. It was incredible. The community rallied. And so on the second scheduled Sunday, we had our actual first worship service, which was ironically the water ceremony right after the hurricane. And I had volunteered to lead the water ceremony. And I'll never forget saying, the water giveth, and sometimes, children, the water taketh away. But in our case, it did not. It did not take away. So that was loud. Got an echo? Weird. Okay. I think that was an act of God. Anyhow, then the pandemic came. Oh, crazy. Oh, good question.
Maybe to the left.
Yeah, I could use the handheld instead, or I could just stand here.
Also, this is, it's the other and up. Okay. Good.
Take that as a cue. I need to wrap it up. The good news is no one from our congregation was lost to the pandemic. Because we switched to Zoom, and again, thank you to Debbie Zill for helping make that, and Sharon her, and the support of others, making it happen that we were able to, for more than a year, keep our building closed so we could protect everybody from the pandemic, from the coronavirus. No one was lost to the coronavirus, where other congregations of all faith paths around the country were losing members. We lost no members to the pandemic, for which I am eternally grateful. So my opinion of CUUC is not just that it's the little church that could. It is an engine that keeps going. It is a place for miracles to happen, and they keep happening. And here we are coming to, next year will be 10 years in our building on West Street. We are 30 years from the germination, the idea that started it all. And it just gets better and better. So thank you for being a part of our congregation. And again, if you're here for the annual meeting, I've got extra leis.